Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the all-new Anbernic RG35XX H. If you remember correctly, last month they kind of made a splash with a new handheld known as the RG35XX Plus, powered by Allwinner's new H700 CPU, which does put out a bit better performance than the RG3566 that we're used to seeing in these handhelds. And with that one, we got kind of a DMG style form factor, otherwise known as a vertical form factor. But with the RG35XX H, we've got a horizontal layout here, and they've also included dual analog sticks with this new handheld. Now, before we get into this, a few things I want to get out of the way. Retail price on this is going to be set at around $67.99. That's USD. This is going to be releasing January 5th, 2024. So keep an eye out on their official website. I'll leave some links in the description. I was lucky enough to get my hands on one of these a bit early for testing, and I've had it for about 5 days. I love this handheld. Form factor fits right in your pocket. We've actually got some pretty decent performance here. Now, it's not a top-of-the-line device on par with something like an x86 handheld, i.e. Steam Deck or the ROG Ally, but the price reflects that, coming in at under $70. This is more for retro emulation, and it does it very, very well. Right off the bat, very pocketable device. We've got those dual analog sticks up front here. This is using micro switches for the shoulder buttons and the triggers, but under the D-pad and the face buttons A, B, X, Y, we've got a conductive pad, and it's using a great Anbernic D-pad. Now, this is one of my favorite D-pads that we see on these retro devices, so you're definitely going to be able to play your favorite fighting games, pulling off your special moves, and platformers with this unit. We've also got dual stereo speakers. Now, they are downward firing, but usually the way I hold this handheld, it kind of reflects off of my palm right into my face, and it actually sounds really good. Glad to see we've got dual speakers here instead of single, like on the Plus model. And again, we've got their good old D-pad, so this does feel really nice. Conductive pads under that and the face buttons. And speaking of the face buttons, we do have quite a bit of throw. This is something that I actually like. That way they're not flush mount with the body itself, so you know what button you're pressing at any given time. Same thing over here with the D-pad. And again, can't stress this enough, D-pad on this thing is amazing. When it comes to the overall layout, up top here, as you can see, we've got our shoulder buttons, we've got our trigger buttons. These are using micro switches. We've also got a 3.5mm audio jack, dual USB Type-C. We also have a mini HDMI port, so we can connect this to a larger screen pretty easily, and a menu button. So whether you're using RetroArch or a standalone emulator, you can press this and get into the menu at any given time. Over here on the right-hand side, we've got a dedicated power button and a dedicated reset button. Over on the left, we've got our volume rocker, and on the bottom, dual micro SD card slots. So I really like the fact that they keep this going because we can run our operating system from one, we don't have to worry about ejecting that card or anything, and store all of our games on the other. And when it comes to the specs here, like I mentioned, it's very close to the RG35XX Plus. For the CPU, we've got that new Allwinner H700. This is a quad-core ARM Cortex-A53 CPU at 1.5 GHz. The GPU is a Mali G31 MP2, 1 GB of LPDDR4 RAM, a 3.5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 640 by 480, 5 GHz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, dual micro SD card slots, built-in vibration motor, so you do get a little bit of feedback when you're playing your favorite retro games, a 3300 mAh battery, which does offer some decent battery life. By the end, we'll take a look at all of that. And this is running a Linux operating system. Same thing that was on the RG35XX Plus. And I'm sure we will see custom firmware or even modified stock firmware. But for now, we're going to be using what came on this. It's running from one of the micro SD cards. The other one does have my ROMs on it, like most of their devices. So we've got those dual micro SD card slots. Now, you could run everything from a single if you wanted to, but having those dual cards just really makes it handy to add more games. Okay, so I figured it'd be a bit easier to get a feel for how everything works here if I plug this into my game capture. Remember, we've got that mini HDMI on the top, and it actually looks pretty good going to a big display. So from the main menu, we've got a few selections. Game rooms, RA games, favorites, history, search, and settings. From settings, battery, just give us the voltage here. Lock screen, backlight brightness, 5 different levels here. I/O test, and this is actually really nice for the built-in analog sticks. So yeah, everything is working really well with this. Date and time, language settings, RetroArch settings. With this, we can reset the RetroArch config in case you messed anything up. or we could start RetroArch from here and change our settings. Network settings. Remember, we've got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi here, 5 GHz Wi-Fi, along with Moonlight built in. So we could actually stream from our own PC, basically like Steam Link here. We've got a few to choose from here. I'm just using Icon Set 4, but you can go with what you'd like here. Moving down a bit, background settings. And this is just going to give us different background. Not a lot to mess around with in the operating system right now when it comes to customizations, but I'm sure we're going to see some custom firmware for this, or modified stock firmware. We can customize our button layout, firmware version, reboot, and shut down. So yeah, we definitely need some more settings to mess around with, but this is actually great to get into. Search function actually works out pretty well. So let's say if we wanted to play Tekken, we can pull up all of our Tekken games from what we've got installed on the card right now. History, favorites, and of course we've got the game rooms and the RA game. From game rooms, this is where our standalone emulators are going to be located, and we've got quite a few to choose from. To tell you the truth, with this Linux operating system, for the lower end stuff, I personally just use RetroArch, really have some good luck with that. Aside from PSP, using PPSSPP up at the top. And if you wanted to go with PS1 here, you could. But, with what I've been testing so far, the RetroArch core just functions really well on this H700 chip. Moving back out, now we've got our RetroArch section. So we've just got it divided up into our different categories: PSP, Open Bore, Dreamcast, PlayStation, Neo Geo, CPS 3, 2, 1, FB Neo, got some Homebrew, MAME, Atari, Virtual Boy, Pico, Game & Watch, GBA, Famicom, Super Famicom, otherwise known as Super Nintendo in the US, Game Boy Color, Game Gear, Super Master System, Genesis, Game Boy, PC Engine, Neo Geo Pocket Color, WonderSwan, Naomi, Atomic Wave, NDS, MSX, and we've got some ports right here. And there's actually quite a few that I've installed. A lot of this stuff runs really, really well. I mean, they're definitely older ports, but on this new chipset that they're using, I've been seeing some really great performance. So one of my favorite things about this new chipset that they're using here, the All-Winner H700, is the performance it's putting out. It's actually much better than I thought it would be, and it handles Dreamcast really, really well. I'm using Flycast right now. We've got Crazy Taxi 2 running really well. Now, I did run into a couple games that were a bit slower, like DOA 2. That's just a really hard one to emulate. But with some tweaking and tuning down the road, I do think that we'll be able to get most of these games to run at full speed. And as you can see, with Crazy Taxi 2 here, I am using the analog stick to control my character. One of my favorite games for Dreamcast is Vip-Urcdkey, and as you can see, it is a bit slow here. Now, I do think that I could add a little bit of frame skip from the settings, but I just left it stock to see what it would do. I could still play through this just fine. It just seems a bit slow because I have played this quite a bit on original hardware. Now, of course, when it comes to PlayStation emulation, it doesn't take much, but the H700 chip in here handles everything that I've thrown at it, from Gran Turismo up to Bloody Roar 2, and with this I did turn the sound off because it is copywritten music, but this is one of those games that does struggle on lower-end chipsets. But now, with the H700, we're not going to have any issues with PlayStation emulation on these devices. I also went through and tested out some Naomi and Atomic Wave games. Remember, we're still using that Flycast core here. This is Dolphin Blue, it's running really well, but when there's a ton of particles on screen, I do notice a little bit of slowdown here and there. But this is way better than the RG35XX, and yeah, I mean, I really can't wait to see what developers do with the H700. Getting some custom firmware on this thing with some tweaks for these emulators is going to be amazing. Also wanted to show off a little bit of Game Boy, and it does scale up pretty nicely on this 4:3 aspect ratio display. Now, one thing that I like doing is changing it to look like an original Game Boy or a DMG, giving me that pea green, and with RetroArch, it's pretty easy to do so. This is a bit darker than I personally like. I mean, it's really on par with the real screen of a DMG, but you can kind of lighten this up a bit, so when you're in really dark situations, you can see it a bit better. Now, of course, we had to test out this D-pad, but pulling it right out of the box, I knew they did right with this, with that conductive pad. I mean, it's right on par with their other D-pads. And what I'm running right now is actually the PSP version of Alpha 3. I just wanted to test out a few PSP games. Now again, the H700 does much better than the 3566, but it's not going to do every single PSP game, so just keep that in mind. But this D-pad is awesome. I mean, it's got some amazing roll to it. Okay, so first impressions, I really do like the RG35XX H. Really glad to see a new chipset. I'm sure we're going to see this in more handhelds. It's a pretty decent performer for now until we get something a bit more powerful. Button layout is great. One thing that I'm used to is kind of the Xbox analog stick layout. Not asymmetrical like PlayStation, but I've really been getting used to it. I personally use the D-pad a lot more on my retro games than I do an analog stick. I mean, you can basically set it up anyway. And while I'm using the D-pad, I tend to knock around the bottom analog stick there, so sometimes I do get messed up with movements. But you can disable that in RetroArch. Some of the standalone emulators will also let you do that. Really loving this layout, and when it comes to battery life, I've been doing a little bit of testing. I got 6 hours and 45 minutes out of this. And through my testing, screen brightness was at 100%, and I just ran a loop of Soul Calibur with the Flycast core. So if you were playing something that didn't need to hit the CPU and GPU up as much, you could get more out of it for sure. So overall, really been enjoying the RG35XX H, and I really can't wait to see what the community does with firmware. Even just having the stock firmware modified with some tweaks and things like that would be nice, but I'm pretty sure we're going to see a full-fledged different front end on this device. The H700, I believe, will be used in more devices in the future, so it makes sense for them to kind of get the ball rolling right now so they could just easily port that over to other devices. But until then, I think they did a pretty decent job with stock firmware the way it is right now. I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye out, and I will have a couple more videos coming as soon as we get something from the community. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. I really appreciate you watching. If you're interested in learning a little more about this, I will leave a link to If you're interested in learning a little more about the RG35XX H, I will leave a link in the description. And remember, this is going to retail for around $68, and it releases January 5th, 2024. If you've got any questions, let me know in the comments below. And like always, thanks for watching.